The light came out of nowhere. One moment, we were sitting around the campfire, its flickering glow illuminating the close circle of our group, and the next, the world was drenched in an intense, silent white. It wasn't a flash, not like lightning or a camera bulb. It was a suffocating brightness that swallowed the forest whole, blinding us without warning. I remember shielding my eyes, feeling an icy grip of fear clawing at my chest. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, the fire was still crackling, its embers glowing just as before. My heart hammered as I glanced at my watch. No time had passed. Midnight, exactly as it had been. The others were stirring too, rubbing their eyes, muttering about strange dreams and dizziness. But there were no answers, no sense to what had happened. It was as if the light had never existed. We carried on the next morning, shaken but determined not to let a shared hallucination, if that's what it was, derail our hike. The trail snaked through dense woodland, shadows stretching long under a pale sky. As the day went on, fatigue set in, far heavier than it should have. It was more than exhaustion, it was a creeping malaise that sank into our bones. Then it happened again. The blackout came without warning. One moment I was stepping over a gnarled root, and the next I was on my knees in the dirt, staring at the ground as my vision swam back into focus. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my skin prickled with cold sweat. Slowly, I realized I wasn't alone. One by one, the others came too, groaning and bewildered. That's when I felt a burning itch just behind my ear. I scratched absent-mindedly, only to wince as my fingers brushed something raw. A scar, small, circular and tender, as if it had only just healed. The others noticed theirs too, their faces pale as they touched identical marks. By the time we descended the mountain days later, those scars were the least of our worries. We were exhausted, our nerves shredded by the repeated blackouts, and our food supply dangerously low. But eventually, mercifully, the car park came into view. Relief turned to horror when we found the police waiting for us. The search party had been called off only that morning, they said, after weeks of combing the wilderness. Weeks. Yet according to us and our watches, we hadn't been gone more than 4 days. The officers eyed us strangely as though we were ghosts risen from the dead. Back home, life crawled back to some semblance of normality. The scars faded, though the itch never truly went away. Nightmares plagued me, fragmented images of dark figures. I stopped hiking, barely left the house. And then it began. First, it was Jess. She simply didn't show up to work one day. No calls, no messages, no sign of her. The police found her flat untouched, her phone still on the kitchen counter. A week later, it was Mark. He vanished during a weekend trip to visit his parents. No one saw him leave, no CCTV footage, nothing. Now I sit here, the itch behind my ear almost unbearable. The others are all gone. I know it's my turn. The light from the street lamp outside flickers and my heart stutters. I close my eyes and the world turns white. We all watched as a streak of fire flew across the evening sky. The 6 of us were resting on a rocky outcrop after a long day's hike, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The meteor blazed across the horizon, its tail burning bright orange, and for a moment it seemed like the perfect capstone to an already beautiful day. Then it hit. The impact was so close it shook the ground beneath us, a low rumble rolling through the forest like thunder. A plume of smoke curled up from the valley below, black against the dimming sky. I remember the air feeling charged, electric, as though the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. It wasn't a discussion, more a shared impulse. We grabbed our torches and made our way down the ridge, curiosity driving us forward. The smoke led us to a clearing we hadn't seen before, the trees surrounding it bent and charred. In the center of the scorched earth was the crater, a jagged wound in the ground that pulsed with heat. The object at its core wasn't a meteor. It was smooth and metallic, a dull gunmetal grey that seemed to drink in the light. The air around it shimmered like heat haze, distorting its edges. There were no markings, no seams, just a perfect ovoid shape nestled in the earth. It was large enough to swallow a car whole. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the crackling of burned wood the only sound. Then the figures emerged. They looked like shadows, moving unnaturally against the glow of our torches. They were tall, and their limbs were long and thin. Their movements were jerky, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. As they stepped closer, I realized their skin wasn't skin at all, but something hard and glassy, like polished obsidian. And their faces, if you could call them faces, were smooth, blank plates, save for two glowing pinpricks of white where eyes should have been. Someone screamed, and that was all it took. We ran, our torches swinging wildly as we plunged into the forest. The figures moved after us, their spindly limbs slicing through the darkness. They didn't make a sound, not a footfall, not a breath. The only noise was the pounding of my heart and the panicked cries of the others. I don't know how long we ran. Time blurred into a frantic, desperate sprint. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches snagging at our clothes. One by one, the screams behind me stopped. I didn't turn back. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the faint hum of those things cutting through the night. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I didn't dare stop. I could still feel their glowing eyes on me. When I finally burst out of the woods, the silence was deafening. I collapsed, my body heaving with exhaustion, and turned back towards the tree line. They were standing there, perfectly still, their faces blank and featureless. I don't know why they didn't follow, maybe they didn't need to. I stumbled into the nearest town at dawn, my clothes torn, my hands bloodied. I told them what had happened, but the search party found nothing, only an empty crater. The others were gone, and I was left with the memory of those hollow, glowing eyes and the soundless way they moved through the dark. It was a perfectly routine time, well, as routine as it could be when you're aboard the ISS. We were running diagnostics, taking readings, and following the meticulous schedule NASA had laid out. The monotony of life up here means you take comfort in the repetition, in the structure. It keeps your mind steady. Well, at least it's supposed to. I was in the middle of speaking with Mission Control about a systems update when the static hit. I thought it was a minor transmission issue, a common enough occurrence, but the static didn't stop. It grew louder, more distorted. Then, just as I was reaching to adjust the comms equipment, the station went dark, pitch black. The emergency systems should have kicked in immediately, but for those few seconds it was like the ISS was dead. The only sound was of my own breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. Then the emergency lights flickered on, turning everything red. I floated to the window, instinctively looking out at Earth. It was then I noticed the shadow. The shadow didn't just engulf us, it covered the whole of Earth during day into night. It made the temperature drop instantly. The shadow was cast by something massive. An alien ship. I have spent years studying space, watching satellites and debris move through the void, understanding the scale of things out here. Nothing could have prepared me for this. It dwarfed everything I'd ever seen, a structure so vast it defied comprehension. The surface pulsated with a faint, sickly green light, and strange, vein-like structures ran along its length. The rest of the crew had gathered by now, staring out the windows in stunned silence. Then we saw the lights on Earth. Flashes, explosions. The ship began to move, descending slowly toward the planet. From our vantage point, we had the perfect view of what came next. Smaller crafts emerged from the larger one, swarming down like insects toward the cities below. It looked like it was some sort of coordinated invasion, but then I realized it was worse than that. They weren't just attacking, they were annihilating. Through the observation windows, we could see beams of light followed by what looked like explosion. Entire sections of cities vanished in an instant. Fires erupted, lighting up the darkness below, but it didn't matter. The scale of the destruction was beyond anything Earth could fight against. One of the crew tried to re-establish contact with Mission Control, but the comms were still dead. We were trapped, helpless, watching our planet being dismantled piece by piece. And there was nothing we could do. Time moved strangely after that. Minutes felt like hours as we floated in silence, our eyes glued to the horror unfolding below. The red emergency lights bathed everything inside the station in a hellish glow. None of us spoke. There wasn't anything to say. I don't know how long we watched before the realization set in. We're not safe up here. If they're harvesting the planet, it's only a matter of time before they notice us. The ISS is just a speck compared to their ship, but it's close enough. We're not invisible. We've barricaded ourselves in one of the modules now, though it feels ridiculous. What good will a locked hatch do against something that size? Supplies are limited, oxygen is finite. And even if we had the means to get back to Earth, what would we return to? Every now and then I catch a glimpse of the ship outside the window. It hasn't moved much, still hovering ominously over the planet. The smaller crafts continue their work, relentless. The fires on Earth have spread, but they're barely visible against the overwhelming blackness. We're running out of options, out of time. I don't know how this will end, but I'm certain of one thing. Whatever those things are, they're not here to negotiate. They're here to take what they want and destroy everything else. And soon, they'll take us too. We were halfway through a month-long trip, transporting goods across the Atlantic, just a small crew, 7 of us. The days were monotonous. Check the machinery, make small talk, and count down the hours until the next meal. Nights were quiet, apart from the groaning of the hull against the waves and the occasional creak of the ship settling. That night, though, something changed. I woke up to the sound of shouting. It was muffled, coming from the corridor outside my cabin. My first thought was that someone had slipped or hurt themselves. It wasn't uncommon with the damp decks. But as I stepped out, groggy and disoriented, I saw the panic in my crewmates' faces. One of us was missing. Evan, the youngest and newest member of the crew. He'd been assigned to the midnight watch, but when his shift ended, he didn't show up to his cabin. His radio was silent. At first, we thought he'd fallen overboard, but there was no sign of a struggle or alarm. We searched the entire ship from bow to stern. Nothing. It was like he had evaporated into thin air. Then we checked the security footage. The bridge had a small setup, ancient and glitchy, but it worked. The camera overlooking the main deck was the only one that caught anything. It seemed like Evan was standing still, staring out at the water. His head tilted to one side, like he was listening to something. Then out of nowhere, his body went rigid and the feed glitched. When the image stabilized, there were shapes, tall, spindly shapes, standing around him. Their features were blurry, almost shimmering, like they weren't quite part of our reality. We watched in horrified silence as they moved closer, fast, and circled him. One of them extended an appendage, long, almost skeletal, and touched his forehead. Evan didn't struggle, he didn't even flinch. A moment later, another glitch, and they were gone. So was Evan. No one spoke. The captain, a grizzled old man who had seen his fair share of oddities at sea, was pale as a ghost. He ordered us to lock every door, seal every hatch, and stay in pairs. Whatever was happening, he said, we weren't letting it take anyone else. But deep down, I think we all knew there was nothing we could do. Over the next few nights, the tension on board became unbearable. Sleep was impossible. Every little sound made us jump, metal clinking, the wind howling, the crash of waves. Then another crewmate disappeared. This time it was Gary. One moment he was in the galley, eating with the rest of us. The next, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, his chair was empty. We checked the footage again. It was the same, the figures, the glitch, and then nothing. One by one they took us, always at night, always when the lights flickered. We tried barricading ourselves in the engine room, thinking the confined space and heavy doors would protect us. It didn't. When the lights went out this time, 2 more were gone. No sounds, no struggle, just empty spaces where our friends had been. The captain tried to make contact with nearby ports, but the radios wouldn't work. Static, garbled nonsense, like the airwaves had been hijacked. Desperately he ordered the engines to full throttle, hoping to reach land sooner, but we all knew it wouldn't matter. Now it's just me. The captain was taken last night. I saw it happen. I watched through a crack in the storage crate I'd hidden in as the figures surrounded him. This time they looked directly at me before they vanished. They knew I was there and they didn't care. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The lights just went out. We thought it was just drawings. I didn't think much of it. My daughter Emily has always been creative, and her latest obsession was using those chunky crayons to sketch colourful scenes. But over the last week, her art took on a peculiar theme. Every picture she drew featured glowing figures with elongated bodies and blank round faces. They hovered above houses, sat on her bed, or loomed in doorways. When I asked her about them, she simply smiled and said they were her nighttime friends. It sounded like an imaginary game, the kind kids play when they're bored. I even showed one of the drawings to my neighbour, who laughed it off as just childhood imagination. But then she froze and said her son had been drawing the same figures, right down to the glowing outlines and faceless heads. Something about that unsettled me. I started to notice more kids in the neighbourhood showing similar artwork, almost identical in fact. At the local park, I overheard parents joking about how their kids must all be copying each other, but it didn't feel like copying. The drawings were too specific, too eerily consistent, and all the kids talked about the figures visiting them at night. Last Thursday, Emily came to me in the morning, clutching another drawing. This one was different. The glowing figure wasn't floating near her bed or smiling like the others. It was crouched in the corner of the room with long, spindly fingers stretching towards her sleeping form. She told me this one whispered to her and that they had lots of things to talk about. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day I decided to set up a camera in her room. I didn't tell her. I didn't want to scare her or make her stop talking to me about it. I just needed to prove to myself that nothing was happening, that all of this was just a bizarre coincidence shared among children with overactive imaginations. The footage from the first night showed nothing unusual. Emily slept soundly, barely moving under her covers. I felt relieved, even a little silly for taking it so seriously, but on the second night, something happened. At around 3 a.m., the camera picked up movement. The room didn't go dark, but there was a flicker. And then, there it was. A figure, glowing faintly, emerged from the far corner of the room. It wasn't a trick of the light or my tired eyes. It was there. Tall, thin, with elongated limbs and no discernible face. Emily stirred and sat up, looking directly at it. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to someone whisper, and then she spoke. I couldn't hear what she was saying. The camera didn't have sound, but she was carrying on a full conversation with this thing. Her gestures were calm, her face serene. Whatever it was, she understood it, and it understood her. I watched, paralyzed, as the figure reached out, brushing her cheek with one of its long fingers. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, laid back down, and pulled her blanket up. The figure lingered for a moment, then disappeared into the same corner it had emerged from, leaving behind a faint shimmer. I turned the video off, my hands shaking. I wanted to confront Emily about it, but I didn't know what to say. How do you ask your child about a glowing figure in their room without sounding completely insane? Instead, I kept her home from school, stayed close to her, and tried not to let my panic show. That night, I locked her bedroom door and stayed up outside her room with a baseball bat, determined not to let anything happen. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard her laughing. It wasn't a playful laugh. It was soft, almost conspiratorial, like she was sharing a secret. When I burst into the room, she was sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at the same corner where the figure had appeared. She turned to me with a look of pure innocence and said, "They're here." I didn't see anything, but I felt a presence that made my skin crawl. I grabbed her and ran out of the room, locking the door behind us. This morning, I checked the footage again. I wish I hadn't. The glowing figure returned, but this time it wasn't alone. 3 more stood in the corner watching her. We were a small documentary team known for taking on obscure and macabre stories. This one, though, had a pull none of us could resist. In the 1930s, a group of Arctic explorers vanished without a trace. They were seasoned, well-prepared, and equipped for the brutal conditions, yet they disappeared. Their last known position was recorded, but search efforts over the years had turned up nothing. We'd set out to film a documentary retracing their steps, armed with the latest tech, drones, and determination. Weeks in, the Arctic had shown us no mercy. Temperatures plummeted to unbearable lows, and the isolation was maddening. Endless stretches of white, but we pushed on. One morning, after setting up camp near a ridge we hadn't planned to explore, our drone picked up something unusual, an anomaly under the ice. It just looked like a strange formation, but as we reviewed the footage, there was no mistaking it. A structure deep beneath the frozen wasteland, a cave system. The excitement was electric, and despite the risks, we decided to investigate. None of us thought it might be a mistake. The mouth of the cave was hidden, concealed beneath jagged ice and snow. It took hours to carve our way in, but when we did, we found ourselves in an enormous underground chamber, the walls glinting with frost. We set up ropes and lights, moving carefully into the depths. That's when it happened. One of the crew, Ben, slipped. It wasn't a normal fall. The ground beneath him simply gave way like a trapdoor, and he disappeared into the darkness. His scream was brief, cut off by a sickening thud far below. We scrambled to the edge, shining our torches down the crevasse. It seemed bottomless at first, but then we saw a vast cavern far below, with something metallic glinting in the faint light. Against all common sense, we climbed down. We couldn't leave Ben, and curiosity gnawed at us. When we reached the bottom, we found him. He was alive but shaken, sitting amidst a scattering of bones. Human bones. Some were ancient, brittle, half buried in the ice. Others looked fresher, though still old. Fragments frozen alongside them matched descriptions of the missing 1930s explorers. Looming in the darkness was a massive structure, clearly not natural. Its surface was smooth, black, and strangely warm to the touch, even in the sub-zero cavern. The craft. There was no other word for it. It was an alien craft. Inside, the air was stale but breathable. As we ventured further, we found them, the explorers. They were arranged in strange positions, as if they'd been studying something, frozen in the act of documenting whatever horrors they'd uncovered. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror, mouths open in silent screams. Among them were other bodies, grotesque and inhuman. They were taller than us, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Some were slumped against the walls, while others were sprawled on the floor, tangled with the human remains. And then the equipment began to malfunction. Our torches flickered, cameras failed, and the temperature seemed to plummet even further. Something stirred in the shadows, a faint scraping sound that grew louder with every second. We ran. I don't know how we made it out, but when we surfaced, it was already night. The cave had started to collapse behind us, sealing whatever was inside. Ben was inconsolable, muttering gibberish about waking something up. We left everything behind. Equipment, footage, notes. It wasn't worth it. One evening, we were sitting in the living room after dinner, flipping through channels as we usually did. It was ordinary, unremarkable. The humdrum noise of news anchors, reality shows, and commercials filled the air. But then, mid-sentence, the program cut out. The screen turned to static, grainy, black and white, like an old-fashioned signal problem. We assumed it was a bad signal, but it wasn't just visual. The static emitted this faint, high-pitched tone, almost imperceptible at first. My wife complained that her ears felt strange, like a faint ringing just on the edge of hearing. Maybe the kids had turned up the volume too high earlier, leaving her sensitive. We tried switching the TV off, but even powered down, we could still hear it. We unplugged the television, thinking it was some electrical fault. The sound stopped and we laughed it off. The next day, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just the television. My son's radio started hissing while he was doing homework. The same static, the same tone. He ran downstairs, pale as a sheet, clutching the device like it might explode. We tried it on different outlets, but nothing changed. By the end of the week, every electronic device in the house had started behaving oddly. Phones, tablets, even the kitchen clock. Anything with a signal or an electrical pulse seemed infected by this static. The sound grew louder. It wasn't just a faint ringing anymore. It was something deeper, resonating inside our skulls, making it hard to think, hard to focus. I started waking up in the middle of the night to a low hum reverberating through the house. It soon became impossible to ignore. My wife said she heard clicking in it, just beneath the surface. I told her it was just her imagination, but privately I'd started to hear them too. We called the utility company, thinking it was some electrical interference from a nearby power line. They checked the house and found nothing wrong. They couldn't even detect the sound we were hearing. It was as if we were the only ones affected. Then the headaches started. First, my daughter complained about sharp pains behind her eyes, then my wife, and then me. By now, the static was constant, filling every room of the house. I became obsessed with figuring out the source. I spent hours dismantling devices, checking circuits, and scouring the internet for explanations. Nothing helped. The static spread, even to devices we'd never had issues with before. When I went outside, it followed me. That's when I noticed the lights in the neighborhood. Street lights flickered erratically. I stopped one of my neighbors to ask if they'd noticed anything strange. They looked at me like I was mad and hurried away. One night around 3 a.m., I woke up to find the television on, even though it had been unplugged for days. The static was brighter, harsher, filling the room with a glow. The sound was deafening now, layered with the clicking that had grown louder over time. I saw something in the static. Shapes, movement. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, almost insect-like, flickering in and out of the screen. My wife screamed from upstairs, and when I ran to her, she was standing by the bedroom window, pointing outside. There were lights in the sky, not aeroplanes, not helicopters. These were bright, pulsating orbs hovering in perfect silence above the treetops. As we watched, paralyzed with fear, the static on the television grew louder, vibrating through the house. The lights began to descend. I grabbed my family and herded them into the car. We drove as fast as we could, leaving the house, the town, everything behind, but the static came with us. The radio in the car started hissing and the clicking returned. We're in a motel now, miles away from home. Every device we've tried to use picks up the same static. My wife is catatonic. My kids won't stop crying, and I don't know how much longer I can take this. I've just looked outside. They have found us. It began with the circles. I'd seen the news stories before, the odd reports of crop formations in other parts of the country, but I'd always dismissed them as hoaxes. Clever ones, maybe, but still the work of bored kids with too much time on their hands. But when I stepped out into my field that morning, the frost crisp underfoot and the dawn sky bruised with clouds, I found myself staring at one of those strange geometric patterns carved into my own wheat. It was perfect. Wide arcs and sharp angles spiraled outwards in a design so intricate it couldn't have been random. My first instinct was anger. The fields were my livelihood, and whoever had done this had trampled through them without a care. But as I wandered closer, the anger began to twist into scared. The stalks weren't broken or bent, they were neatly flattened in unison, as though the whole thing had been pressed down by some enormous invisible hand. Word spread quickly. Neighbors came to gawk, shaking their heads and muttering about pranksters. A few took pictures, posting them online, but by the end of the day, the excitement had died down. I tried to forget about it. But the formations didn't stop. The shapes sprawled across the landscape, creeping from my farm to the neighboring fields. By the second week, my neighbors weren't laughing anymore. There was something about the way the patterns grew, as though they were building towards some purpose. And then the animals started acting strange. My sheep refused to graze near the formation, skirting the edges of the fields with wide, wary eyes. The barn cats vanished entirely, leaving behind their mewling kittens. At night, I'd wake to the sound of low humming, a faint vibration. I wasn't the only one. One night, old Mr. Adams from down the lane swore he'd seen lights darting over the fields, red and blue orbs flickering in the dark. No one believed him, of course. Mr. Adams had always been prone to flights of fancy. But as I lay awake in my bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of those lights, their cold glow dancing across the wheat. The final straw came when the news report aired. I was in the kitchen, my hands still sticky with dirt from the day's work, when the screen flickered to life with grainy footage. It was filmed at night, the camera shaky, but there was no mistaking it. The figure on the screen wasn't human. Its limbs were long and thin, its skin a pale, sickly grey that seemed to shimmer under the moonlight. It moved with a strange, jerking grace, weaving between the stalks of a cornfield like it belonged there. The footage ended abruptly, leaving the news anchor to fill the silence with hollow reassurances about investigations and no immediate threat. But we knew. The formations weren't random, they weren't pranks, they were maps guiding something or someone. The shapes in the fields had grown over time, stretching outwards until they resembled an enormous web, each line and curve connecting to the next. Last night, the lights came for me. I woke to the hum again, louder this time, vibrating through the floorboards. I don't know what they want. I only know they're coming. The patterns have spread far now. We're surrounded and there's nowhere to run.